Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our readings and thoughts from the scriptures. This is Pastor Howie Maxson, and today we will continue our reading through the Gospel of John. We come now to basically the end of Jesus' conversation with his disciples and his arrest in John chapter 18, and we'll be looking at verses 1 through 14. So things move right along in this section of John called the Book of Glory, the second half of the Gospel of John, which begins with Jesus at the supper, the Last Supper with his disciples, and ends ultimately with his resurrection and commissioning. So here we are in John chapter 18, and the NIV simply entitles this section, verses 1 through 14, as Jesus Arrested. And this is what John writes for us. When he had finished praying. So John 17 was Jesus' prayer. And it's made clear in this verse, the first verse of chapter 18, that Jesus was still in the environs of Jerusalem and not in Gethsemane, because verse 1 continues. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley, which is a valley separating Mount Zion, Jerusalem, from Gethsemane. On the other side, there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now, Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden. Now, the other Gospels identify this garden as Gethsemane. John chooses not to at this point, but we know that this is the garden that John's referring to. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. And I think it's important to note that most likely the soldiers were temple guards. They were not Romans. The Romans at this point were not involved in this. This was all on the Jewish leaders of the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees, and the temple officials. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Torches to see, and lanterns, as well as and weapons, just in case there was going to be a scuffle, which I'm sure they were thinking there would be a scuffle. Verse 4, we're told, Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, this redemptive plan that's being fulfilled and revealed in John's gospel to us as we read through this, was established before the foundation of the world, we are told in other places in the New Testament. So Jesus knew. He knows everything. He knows everything to this day, and he knew then what was happening, what was coming. And so he was prepared. The disciples, however, were not. Knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. Notice they didn't necessarily recognize him. They just answered this person that came out to them and asked the question, "Who is it you want?" And so we get the next part of verse 5, "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas, the traitor, was standing there with them. So Jesus is the one who identified himself to this group of Jewish leaders and temple guards carrying weapons. He just told them, I am he," Jesus said. And Judas, at this point, remained silent. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Now, there are some people who use this verse to establish the idea of being slain in the Spirit. I don't see that at all. I see these people as being knocked to the ground by the presence of God in their midst. And this may be the only action, and it is a passive action that Jesus took against them. So he identifies himself. They drew back, fell on the ground, perhaps because he used what theologians call that tetragrammaton. I am, the name of God, the unspeakable and forbidden name of God, that the Jews would translate into Jehovah because they could not pronounce the words that God identified himself to Moses with. I am who I am. Jesus identifies himself. I am he. Needless to say, excuse me for a second. I touched something I shouldn't have touched, and I just lost. There we go. I lost where I was, literally, on the laptop. Needless to say, they were taken aback. So the story goes on, and again he asks them in verse 7, "Who is it that you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered this time, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." So his next action was to seek to protect his disciples. This was all now focused on Jesus. And he didn't want his disciples involved in this. He wanted them protected. This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." And of course that prophecy comes from John chapter 6, verse 39. It's not an Old Testament prophecy. It is what Jesus spoke in the past. Verse 10, "Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear." He didn't do that at the command of Christ. He took an initiative. He didn't literally stick his foot in his mouth per se. But here Jesus is beseeching the arresting group to let his disciples go, and Peter steps right in and makes an issue that could have landed him in prison or on a cross. The servant's name was Malchus. John identifies this. The other gospel writers don't. And in verse 11, Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Now, in another place, Jesus commands his disciples, when he's talking about him going away, them being on their own in this world, he says, take a couple of swords with you for protection. So there are issues dealing with self-defense. But in this case, Peter, once again, is trying to interrupt the plan of God. He doesn't know it. He's not doing this maliciously in that sense. He's just trying to defend Jesus, just like he did in Matthew 16, when after he was commended for the insight that God had given him as to who Jesus is, the Messiah, the Christ, he immediately, when Jesus starts talking about going to Jerusalem for what's happening here in John to take place, Peter steps in and says, "No way, this could never happen to you, O Lord." And Jesus then turns to Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are thinking like a man of the world. You are not thinking according to God's plan." And so here's Peter again, trying to step in the way, innocent because of his ignorance, and yet committing a crime that could be, that's not defensible in court. The bottom line is, though, that Peter got away with it. Luke tells us that Jesus healed the ear of Malchus, which was an amazing, in-their-face miracle. So I'm certain that those kinds of things distracted this arresting crowd from taking the disciples with Jesus. And it's God's plan. It was Jesus, the righteous one, John tells us in 1 John chapter 2, who made atonement for our sins. Not the disciples. Not Peter. Not John. None of the disciples could have done what Jesus did for us. God sent his one and only Son into the world, that whoever believes in him might not perish but have everlasting life. Jesus is the one and only righteous one who made atonement for our sins and for the sins of the world. And so what Peter was doing was out of the will of God, out of the plan of God, I should say at least, and Jesus rebukes him for that. So we go on. Jesus is committed to his Father's will. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? He's not going there blind to the fact that it's going to be a horrible time of suffering and real suffering for him. But he is committed to God's will, no matter the consequences. Then the detachment of soldiers, with its commander and the Jewish officials, arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. His advice was based on keeping the peace so the Romans would not come in with arresting and perhaps killing a bunch of people. Caiaphas wanted peace. He didn't want his position disrupted. He didn't want his plans disrupted. So he came up with the idea, it's good for one man to die for the good of the people, for the peace, so the Romans wouldn't come after them. Not knowing that he was actually speaking what God decided was good. It was good for God to send his one and only Son, the righteous one, to make atonement for our sins. So this is what's happening as we read through John chapter 18, verses 1 through 14. Next video we will continue. May God bless you, and may God give you the insight and wisdom to not step ahead of God in his plan or get in the way of God in his plan, but to be truly followers of the way, the truth, and the life that is Jesus Christ. God bless your day.